Remuria was a very interesting quest that gave us a ton to think about. Not only were we able to finally understand what really happened and who Remus actually was, it also brought a lot of questions, huge questions I might say, that need to be answered, which is the purpose of this very long video. As always, this is a theory video. I will use information available in the game, but my theories and conclusions are not to be considered the official lore of the game, unless I got something right and it's confirmed in a later update of the game itself. In this video we will talk about 6 main topics. As you can see from the chapters in the timeline, they are Remuria's story, Remus' story, the Dragon Sovereign of Water, the Chiefdoms of the High Waters, Sybilla, and Fortuna, which is split in 2 different chapters. I usually begin my quest analysis videos with a recap of the quest, but this time I found it easier to just talk about the entirety of Remuria's history from its inception to its fall, ending with the world quest. After Remus fled from Sumeru, he ended up on the High Waters, where he accidentally entered some ancient ruins, where he met Sybilla and her golden bees near a petrified Irminsul tree. She told Remus about his fate. He was destined to build a great nation that would have inevitably fallen. Despite this prophecy, Remus accepted his fate and the challenge, so Sybilla transformed the petrified tree into a huge ship, the Fortuna, and followed him. Remus indeed built a gorgeous nation and brought peace, justice, order, and progress to the High Waters that were still suffering from the ignorance forced upon them by the first deluge, but around a century before the prophesied fall of Remuria, Remus started to worry. Because he didn't want to accept this fate, Sybilla decided to bring him to Egeria in the Primordial Sea to have her explain the reasons behind the prophecy, even though she knew it would have changed nothing. There, Remus met Scylla, the Prince Bishop tasked with guarding Egeria during her confinement. They fought for a whole month, and once both exhausted, Remus used music to explain why he was there in the first place. Scylla, who has suffered a far greater fate at the hands of the Primordial One and then of the Heavenly Principles, witnessing firsthand the death of the Dragon Sovereign of Water he once served, the loss of their land and of their freedom, was baffled by Remus' stupid attempt to defy fate, but it was precisely because he wanted to rebel against the Heavenly Principles that he allowed Remus to meet Egeria. So Egeria told Remus about her original sin that caused the prophecy, and as Sybilla anticipated, this didn't give him anything to work with. Before leaving, Remus took a cup of primordial water, what he called Ichor, and promised Egeria that he would have found a way to ensure everlasting peace to the people of his nation and of the High Waters. He then decided to seal his subjects' souls into insoluble ichor and give them indestructible bodies made of bronze and stone that would have withstood the second inevitable deluge. He then began to subjugate every single person he could find on the High Waters to save them from the prophecy, granting them these new bodies, promising them that they would have survived and that they would have eventually received the power to forge their own fate. Among these people, he picked 4 special ones who then became the Harmosts, granting them greater powers and the ability to control his symphonies. They were Cassiodor, Boethius, Euergetia, and Aurelius. The 4 Harmosts helped Remus to annex various chiefdoms of the High Waters. Cassiodor, Euergetia, and Aurelius believed that they should have come to an understanding with the barbarians and convinced them with diplomacy to join Remuria, while Boethius just wanted to raze them to the ground. Remus, to keep his promise to these new Remurians, created individual symphonies that allowed the people to, kinda, decide their own fate, but this terrified them because the weight of fate was too much for them to bear alone, so they begged Remus for guidance. When Sybilla reminded Remus that fate was still the same, instead of being discouraged, Remus got even more fired up and began to study the musica mundana, so fate, in its smallest details, and eventually he actually managed to figure it out. Because he didn't have the power nor the tools to write the incredible fate-defying symphony that he envisioned, he asked Sybilla for help and she, without hesitation, sacrificed herself, becoming the Golden Symphony, Phobos, a music that could weave fate. The symphony began to play across the entire nation, granting the people new paths and promising them that they would finally be able to define their own fate. The people though became over-dependent on Phobos, they became unable to make decisions without it, and they followed it blindly, without questioning its decisions. This honestly sounds a lot like the Akasha system, by the way. Anyway, Phobos, on the other hand, seeing that the fate hadn't been changed at all, decided that Remus's pacific ways wouldn't have made any progress. She reacted to the wishes of those who believed that the prophesied discord caused by the savages of the bygone era, the natives of the high waters, could have been solved by simply removing the problem at its source, annihilating anyone who didn't comply. So Phobos began her secret rebellion against Remus, fully aware that the people of Remuria would have followed her orders blindly. She even chose Boethius as the leader of the rebellion, the one harmless who shared this line of thought, so countless native Fontanians were disposed of. Cassiodor and his companions at the time were trying to contain the primordial water that was starting to leak into the high waters, so the beginning of the prophecy, and Boethius took advantage of his absence to bring rulers, nobles, and polities under his control. When Cassiodor came back, he met with Remus, and both of them realized that something was off. The symphony had changed. As a failsafe, Remus set Cassiodor free from Phobos, gave him a new name, Uranides Uranopolis, and tasked him with the salvation of the Remurians from Phobos' control. Later, Boethius, assisted by his new puppets, challenged Remus's decisions and authority, and above all, his choice to stop the symphony, but also proposed an even greater punitive expedition against the natives, something Remus never asked for in the first place, but that now was what Remuria wanted. Remus then met with Scylla in secret. Scylla reprimanded him for his failure in defying fate and was ready to leave and go back to Egeria, but Remus had one last plan for him. He entrusted Scylla with a final symphony, the Requiem, that would have caused Phobos to self-destruct. Scylla was supposed to lead his bishop army and march to the Domus Aurea, where Remus would have sacrificed himself, unleashing Phobos' full power so that Scylla could have controlled it and stopped it once and for all with the Requiem, freeing the souls of the people of Remuria from their stone bodies and turning them back into normal human beings. Boethius though found out about the secret plan, Remus's betrayal as he called it, and gave the order to seal Portus Antiquus, so the harbor, and the Initium Iani, set 7 defense layers, trap the bishops, and then destroy them. He even prepared 3 chains made with the blood of the harmless Euergetia, and with the bone of an unspecified being, to imprison Scylla for all eternity in case he couldn't be slain. So was Scylla chained in Machimos, preventing him from completing his side of the mission. Remus, on the other hand, did sacrifice himself and disappear completely, but because Boethius had sealed everything, Phobos' power went out of control with no one to stop her. Cassiodor, together with the Remurians he was able to save, joined the Fontanians and helped them fight against the remnant forces of Remuria, and after a long fight, he was able to seal both Boethius and Remuria itself. When Egeria was finally free from her containment and became the Archon, he joined her cause and moved to the abandoned village of Petrichor to keep the seals under control. One day he met Ruggiero and they started working together. Cassiodor, who now was calling himself the Golden Hunter, never told him that he was a survivor of Remuria, but when Ruggiero figured it out by himself, he realized that, contrary to what was common knowledge, the Marechaussee hunters that followed Cassiodor, like Este and Walter, and the Loch Knights that protected the Oceanids against Remuria were the same people. They were Remurian soldiers that rebelled against their own nation to save the Fontanians. Still talking about Ruggiero, he wrote something pretty enigmatic in his third notes. He talks about humanity trying to control knowledge beyond their abilities, and it sounds like either Remus or Boethius tried to use forbidden knowledge, but since it's too vague, I would leave it there as just a possibility that can't be confirmed. Lastly, about Ruggiero, he proposed to rebuild Petrichor in order to attract people and spread different versions of the legend, so that these new inhabitants would have voluntarily protected the seals themselves. Now fast forward to the present, Boethius, well Phobos disguised as Boethius, managed to reconstruct the symphony, albeit a modified version of it filled with sorrow, that stripped the people of Petrichor of their souls, substituting them with those of the ancient Remurians, which was the first step toward the revival of Remuria. In Petrichor, the traveler met a sparkling talking cat, Uranides the Uranopolis, Cassiodor, the spirit keeper of Remuria, who asked the traveler to help him put an end to Boethius' madness, and of course he agreed. After freeing Scylla from the chains and with his help, we were able to reach the Domus Aurea, and thanks to Scylla's requiem and Cassiodor's sacrifice, Phobos' madness was finally and permanently over. To conclude this chapter, let's quickly talk about the names we read during this quest. The Uranides are the first generation of the Titans in Greek mythology, the children of Gaia, the earth, and Uranos, the sky. We already know the names of some of the Uranides from Genshin Impact. Hyperion in Enkanomiya was one of them. Okeanos is the father of the Oceanids, and lastly the quest in the Orphan of Memory was called Muse's mother, and that is Mnemosine, another Uranides. Sybilla comes from the Sibyls, the Okay, I figured it out. Prophetesses or oracles of ancient Greece, with the most famous one being the Sibyl of Delphi. But I think that the most interesting one is Phobos. He is the Greek god and personification of fear and panic, son of Ares and Aphrodite and brother of Deimos, the personification of dread and terror, which could be easily associated to how the savages saw Remus. Plus, Deimos was also Scylla's father. Now I believe we should analyze Remus specifically, because up until 4.6 we had a very different idea of who he was. Remus was once a singer of the Oasis from Sumeru, but when Deshret conquered his land, Remus decided not to bow and fled the nation, aimlessly wandering, searching for a place to die. Considering how Remuria was built after Gurabat fell, and considering that he was associated with the Oasis of Sumeru, I want to say that Remus was potentially a genie, and that he fled because he didn't want to be bottled like the other genie, but there's basically nothing backing this up, so just know that this is a possibility. Remus turned out, contrary to what has been handed down in history, not to be a ruthless evil god king that wanted to impose his beliefs and his ruling over the others. He actually wanted to create a peaceful nation, and he never gave the order to vanquish those who wouldn't submit. Remus's faults were his overconfidence in being able to defy fate and Boethius. Then, when the situation started to look grim, he went down a desperate path filled with madness, cursing his own people with a power that only hurt them just to pursue what he believed to be in their best interests, so to fight against fate and the heavenly principles, freeing everyone from the shackles of the fate that they imposed. Ironically, Remus didn't bow down to Deshret, but in the end he did the same mistakes, so they thought alike. Still, just like Deshret, Remus regretted his actions and decided to put an end to this madness, especially because he realized that his own symphony was rebelling against him. Again, just like Deshret, Remus asked a higher being for help and sacrificed himself, with the only difference being that Rukkhadevata managed to help Deshret at the best of her abilities, while Scylla was stopped before he could execute the plan. In the end, because of Phobos' actions, Remus was globally considered to be an evil tyrannical god, while in reality he didn't want to achieve his goal through violence, and even though he had the power to do it, he wasn't really capable of hurting the humans. He was just another desperate god that fell because he couldn't accept fate. By the way, Remus, if you knew from the beginning that the high waters were going to be destroyed by a flood, why didn't you just build your nation somewhere else? The next topic of this video is the Dragon Sovereign of Water. Cassiodor told us something extremely interesting. No new Hydro Archon could be born so long as the Mistress of Many Waters hibernated in the deep seas. I think the explanation may be very simple actually. To make it easier, imagine that the Primordial One stole one half of the Water Dragon's authority, while the other half was left where it belonged. Now remember that Egeria was created to be an artificial water dragon, and she was given the stolen half authority in order to be able to use the Primordial Sea's power. This means that when she was imprisoned in the Primordial Sea, both halves of the authority were in the same place. The authority was somewhat complete. This may be the reason why the Primordial Sea, the Fontamer that seems to have some level of sentience, didn't feel the need to create a new sovereign. Once Egeria was freed though, the Primordial Sea only had one half of the authority, it wasn't complete anymore, so it created a new Dragon Sovereign, Neuvillette, so that he could find the other half and bring it back, reuniting both halves once again. Of course, the Phantomer doesn't know about the Gnosis, the Archons, the Seats in Celestia, it's not that sentient. This applies to basically almost every elemental dragon in Teyvat. Apart from Apep, who is still the original one, and excluding the ones that she said accepted this fate and decided not to come back to life, the Geo and Anemo Sovereigns, but also Nibelung, came back to life as new dragons, retaining most of their predecessors' memories. What I mean to say is that the primordial, what should I even call them? Primordial elemental nations? Anyway, these concentrations of primordial elements will always produce a new dragon. They will always yearn for the powers they were stolen. Before moving on to the last two heavy topics of this video, I think it would be best to relax with a lighter one, the Chiefdoms of the High Waters. As we know, the High Waters had been ravaged by the first deluge when Egeria committed her sin, that is trying to create a new race of humans through the Primordial Sea without the Heavenly Principle's permission. She was then confined in the Primordial Sea as a punishment, and the High Waters were doomed to cyclically fall prey to the floods that kept destroying their civilization, the first one being the first deluge. Its consequences were dramatic, many people lost their lives and the ones that survived were sent back to a primitive stage. Without order, civilization, progress, they lost everything, reason why they were called savages of the bygone era. It is still my belief that these deluges are the consequence of a celestial nail being sent down. We can't see it, and I don't know if we ever will, but just like the one on Tsurumi Island that is nowhere to be found, we definitely see the consequences. Since quite some time had passed since the end of the Envoy Age, when the first deluge happened, when Remus arrived from Sumeru and decided to bring the savages under his kingdom, they weren't really savages anymore. Their society was not based on primitive tribes, they had real chiefdoms. Some of them acted as trade hubs and were prosperous, others had councils composed of clan chiefs or astrologists, and each clan was ruled by an individual defined as Holy King, whose authority was given by the sword that the Mother of Many Springs gave them. The Remurians in general didn't really appreciate these people, they often mocked them and their beliefs without really trying to understand them, even though 3 out of 4 Harmasts were actually trying to do so. The Remurians believed that they worshipped a false, unspecified and probably inexistent god that the savages collectively defined as the Mistress of all Waters, a belief system that seems to have spread from Aremorica, one of the chiefdoms. Despite the fact that Egeria actually existed, the savages didn't really have a precise idea of who this Mistress of all Waters really was. According to Hirtius' records, they seem to have practiced human sacrifices in order to hope for a sign from their god, a sign that couldn't have arrived since Egeria was hibernating in the Primordial Sea. Because the savages' belief system was very vague, the Remurians believed that they had to show them that Remus, the Sebastos, was the only one worthy of being worshipped as a god. Of course, this conversion was imposed with different methods depending on the Harmas that led the legion. Ewargetia was benevolent, so she tried to get to know them and show them the right path. Aurelius simply announced the conquest of the elders of the chiefdoms and annexed them, while Boethius just razed them to the ground. Among the chiefdoms, as we said before, the most important one was Aremorica. Despite the fact that the ruler, Cunoricus, had already joined Remuria and even one of its members, Cassiodor, became a Harmast, Aremorica became the central power behind the rebellion against Remuria when their new leader, Erinies, took over. She claimed to have been blessed by Egeria and that she could hear her voice, but she never really showed any special ability. Nonetheless, she managed to ward the Remurians off for a very long time. In fact, we know that she even survived the second deluge and witnessed Egeria's return, only to realize that Remuria was the product of a promise between Egeria and Remus. As for her name, Erinies, it seems that it's not actually her given name. The Remurians made a mistake when they transcribed it, turning it into a word with no meaning in the language of the savages. The original term was Erinchienth of Aremorica, and it was supposed to mean High Ruler of Aremorica, but since everybody in Remuria kept calling her Erinies, they just let this mistake slide and they kept using it as if it were her real given name. Okay, it's time for the heaviest chapters of this video, starting with Sybilla. As we said before, when Remus left Sumeru and ended up on the high waters, he accidentally entered some ancient ruins where he found a petrified tree protected by Sybilla and her golden bees. She introduced herself as a former envoy that protected the silver tree, but through time she lost her mind and form. Despite that, she could still gaze into the future and make prophecies. This alone is more than enough to figure out what Sybilla actually was, but adding to the mix the shape of the golden bees and the fact that she was the survivor of the first deluge, so the end of the envoy age, it just becomes a certainty. Sybilla was a Seelie. Similarly to Nabu Malikata, she was an anti-husk because of whatever happened that caused the city to be exiled from the heavens and be cursed. Just like Nabu Malikata, she could foresee the future and make prophecies. The only difference between them, I suppose, is that Nabu Malikata was sent down with the celestial nail that turned Sumeru into a desert, while Sybilla was living in the ancient city that got destroyed by the first deluge, the ruins where Remus found her. What's interesting is how Cassiodor mentioned that Sybilla had nearly limitless powers of calculation, but I suppose it just means that her prophecies are not exactly scenes from the future that appeared in her mind, but predictions based on stored information, much like how the Akasha system worked. Whereas the Akasha system needed someone to input data to come up with a calculated prediction of the future, Sybilla, being a Seelie and protecting an Irminsul petrified tree, was most likely using the information stored inside Irminsul itself to predict an outcome that was certain to happen, that is, fate, which takes me to the next chapter of this video, Fortuna. When it comes to what fate in Teyvat actually is, the discussion will inevitably become complicated. So far, we've seen how fate seems to be defined by Irminsul and by the Heavenly Principles. Irminsul gathers information from the memories of the dead that go back to the ley lines, stores them in the stars, the Irminsul fruits, reuses them and predicts or calculates what's going to happen. We can clearly define Irminsul as a computer, which is also hinted at by the fact that Nahida's attacks are basically her stepping on a Dendro keyboard and using a mouse cursor to select the enemies, but also because of how she gave Scaramouche access to Irminsul, making it sound as if she was inputting codes into a command prompt. Irminsul is the computer, the Irminsul fruits are the hard drives, and there are different users with different clearance levels, like Nahida with a fairly high clearance and the Heavenly Principles as probably the administrator. Now, normally Irminsul runs this program, predicts future events that are going to happen no matter what, and everything is fine. In some specific cases though, there are some exceptions that can happen. For example, Forbidden Knowledge is a great and dangerous exception. Even Nabu Malikata couldn't predict what it would have caused to Teyvat, and only saw it as a chaotic darkness. Another one is the Traveler, or a Descender in general. They weren't born in Teyvat, they are not the product of past memories reused by Irminsul, so there is no data about them in the stars. As such, Irminsul can predict their future action, and as a consequence, it can foresee how the future is going to change. Another exception is a person's inner world, their consciousness. We have two examples of this. Makoto was able to create a different future with A and Israf's help, because in the world within their consciousness, they were free from the shackles of the Heavenly Principles, meaning that Makoto's consciousness or inner world is hidden to the Heavenly Principles and to Irminsul, so they couldn't have stopped whatever was about to happen. The second example, the biggest one, is Fossilor. She instructed Furina inside her inner world and told her never to tell anyone about the plan, otherwise it would have immediately failed. This means, again, that everything she said, everything they discussed, and even Furina's repressed desperation happened in a place where the god's gaze does not fall, where neither the Heavenly Principles nor Irminsul could access. The last exception is a Dragon Sovereign with a full authority, something that wasn't supposed to exist at all in Teyvat, until Fossilor managed to make it happen. Since the dragon authorities are apparently more powerful than the heavenly principles, a full dragon has the power to rewrite fate, or better yet, they have the power to input new arbitrary data into Irminsul, changing its calculations, fate, as a consequence. Now, unless we're talking about these kinds of exceptions, everything that just seems like a valid and successful attempt at doing so in reality is part of the predicted fate of the world. The example here is very simple. Kharia used forbidden knowledge, something that Irminsul can compute, so the consequences of the cataclysm were unknown. This was an unforeseeable future, and what Irminsul could do was to wait for the events to end, store the data about the consequences, and come up with a new fate of the world. Differently, all memories about Rukkhadevata and of Scaramouche being removed from Irminsul are part of fate. Irminsul knew that these events were going to happen. Rukkhadevata removing herself from Irminsul was the right, logic and sole decision that could have been taken, and just as she came to that conclusion, so did Irminsul. You can actually double check this theory by reading how Nabu Malikata told Kvarena that Rukkhadevata was going to be forgotten, and she knew it was gonna happen basically at least 1,000 years before it happened. She also said that Aegea is going to be forgotten as well, so I wonder if that's going to happen in Furina's second story quest. Now, going back to Remuria, we have two headache-inducing notes called Harmost's Notes, two documents written most likely by Boethius, who was teaching someone else. The notes talk about how fate was interpreted by Remuria, being a nation based on music. The Remurians believed that there were three different kinds of musica: the musica mundana, the musica umana, and the musica instrumentalis. We will completely ignore the musica instrumentalis because it's simply the music that people can play with actual instruments. Musica mundana, as I said before, is a headache to understand in relation to Fortuna, especially considering how they worded it. Long story short, Fortuna is the rules of Tevat, while Musica Mundana is its consequences, so fate, how the events of the world will inevitably happen because of the rules of Tevat, but also because of how the actions of the humans and of the gods affect each other as a totality. These actions of the humans and of the gods are the Musica Umana. Basically, every human and every god of Tevat can be seen as a single string of a harp. A single string cannot produce a melody alone, but if we pluck all the strings, the harmony that they produce together is the musica mundana. Now, if you play a string at the upper extremity, the sound will reverberate and cause the entire string to play the sound. This is a law of physics, and it happens because the string is attached to the neck of the harp, where the tuning pins that keep the strings taut are. The neck, in this case, is Fortuna, the rules of Tevat, so the laws of physics that the string will follow no matter what. The plucking of an individual string and the vibration throughout its length are the actions of a living being and the consequences that they have on their life as dictated by Fortuna. While the note played by every single string, their vibration, and the harmony produced by the different strings together, reproduced through the soundboard of the harp, is the musica mundana, the fate of the world. Now, because you can play the string wherever you want, so at the extremities rather than the center, the Remurian believed that there was a margin of self-determination, so they believed that people could play their own music, they could control their own will completely. As a consequence, if everyone on the high waters managed to play their own music, and if these individual melodies were accurately merged together to create a great symphony, then the musica umana would have completely substituted the musica mundana, so the people would have finally freed themselves from fate with their own hands. The symphony was Phobos. This whole overcomplicated headache-inducing explanation was also what led Boethius to believe that whoever didn't belong to Remuria, so the savages of the bygone era, needed to be immediately and permanently removed from the equation. They didn't kneel to Remuria, they fought against the symphony, so it was as if they accepted the fate decided by Fortuna. Now, if Remuria is a harp playing a specific melody in unison, they couldn't have other instruments playing a whole different melody at the same time, or the result wouldn't have been a symphony but a cacophony. As a consequence, Remuria should have simply removed those instruments that wanted to keep playing the musica mundana decided by Fortuna, so that the only music being played was the musica umana decided by Phobos. Now, to make all of this even easier, let's revisit the whole thing in terms of a sport, like soccer, even though I'm not an expert. So, soccer has a set of rules that are enforced by a referee. These rules define how the players can move on the field and even what to do if there's a foul. The rules of the game are Fortuna, and everything that happens on the field during the game is Fate. Of course, the movements of a player will inevitably affect the other players in the game because it's a game based on teamwork, and every player has to make decisions on what to do. They are all allowed to move in multiple but specific ways. They can try to steal the ball, they can man-mark someone, they can go toward the opposing goal or toward their own, they can run fast or slow or even stop for a bit, and so on. These decisions that an individual player can make will affect the game. If a player stops, they will end up far from the ball, while if they run fast, they will be closer to it, but they will get tired sooner, which could become an issue later. Again, the result of everyone's movements allowed by the rules and the effect that they have on each other, so how the game is played, is Fate. But if one team arbitrarily decided to come up with a different game using movements that are still within the rules of the game and do not count as fouls, then things will change. The players would have stopped playing soccer and decided to do their own thing without committing any violation of the rules so that the referee can't do anything to stop them. This new game the players came up with is the Musica Umana, and it has substituted the Musica Mundana, soccer itself. But there's still a problem. The enemy team still wants to play regular soccer, so what do? Do you convince them all to play your new game? Well, no, you convince some of them because you still need an enemy team to play soccer or the referee will end the game, and you just kick the rest out of the stadium. Now, to tie back everything we just said with the exceptions we talked about at the beginning of this chapter, how would this soccer game work if one of these exceptions were to happen? Well, imagine that a dog, called Forbidden Knowledge, that a family in the crowd brought with them, lost control, jumped on the field, stole the ball, and started running around at full speed. Now imagine that family entering the field as well to try and stop it, throwing the players on the ground to make way. In this case, no one would know what to do. This is not something covered by the rules of the game, especially because that family wasn't supposed to bring a dog to the soccer game in the first place. It doesn't belong to the stadium. Only when the dog has been caught and the ball retrieved will the referee be able to assess the situation and decide how the game should restart, where the ball should be and who should kick it. This is how Fate can do nothing to predict and prevent these exceptions. It can only calculate a new future based on the resulting state of the world. To conclude this chapter and this video though, since it's all about Fate, we should probably talk about how it was represented in mythology and how that may apply to Genshin Impact. The major question here is, if Fate is decided based on a set of rules, Fortuna, who wrote those rules? Well, considering how to defy Fate, Remus, Nabu Marikata, and Fossolor had to defy the Heavenly Principles, the answer seems pretty easy, except for the fact that we don't know who or what the Heavenly Principles are in the first place, apart from being most likely the first ever Descenders. Mythologically speaking, Fate was usually represented by the Moirai, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, the three sisters from Greek mythology that, respectively, spanned the thread of fate, measured its length, and cut it at the end. This goes perfectly with Sybilla's prophecy. Oceans will rise, empires will fall, and change is the nature of things, meaning that civilizations will always begin to inevitably end, so that a new civilization would rise only to face the same fate. With Arlecchino's quest, we were kinda almost told or made believe that maybe the Three Moon Sisters were actually involved in how fate was decided, making the Crimson Moon very similar to Atropos, the one that cuts the thread, the inevitable, so death. This would mean that the Heavenly Principles should be the Three Moon Sisters that wrote the entirety of Fate. This would raise an issue. Two Moon Sisters are supposed to be dead. It is said that they died or shattered not long after the Nails descended, although the two stories I'm referring to are basically two legends, so we can't be sure about their reliability. The only certainty we have is that they were alive during the Envoy Age, because the people of Tsurumi Island wrote in their murals Lunarum, which means of the moons, Dianas, the plural form of Diana, the goddess of the moon, and Trivia, which is Hecate, another goddess of the moon that is usually depicted as three goddesses. Now, since the moons were alive back during the Envoy Age, it's easy to understand what happened when Nigeria committed her sin. They simply added a new line to the fate of the world so that Fontaine would be cyclically destroyed by floods. What's happening in the present also makes sense. When Nahida said that the Heavenly Principles would awaken if she broke the noses, she meant the remaining moon, who is said to be still grieving the death of her two sisters. My issue with all of this is simple: the Moon Sisters cannot be the Heavenly Principles. With the Seelie being strictly connected to both Fate and the Moon Sisters, it would make more sense that they were higher beings created by either the Primordial One or the Shades and tasked with riding Fate, although it probably had a different meaning and function back then. When the second Who came around though, things changed. Some of you probably know that I believe that the Heavenly Principles are something like three shades created by the second Who came. Just like the Primordial One was always described as a being that stayed outside Teyvat, who created four shades that ruled instead inside the microcosm, so has the second Who came never entered Teyvat, but they created three more shades and sent them inside the microcosm, making them descenders, to rule over it instead. This ties back to my theory that Teyvat is ruled by 7 heavenly virtues, 4 of them the cardinal virtues being the shades, and 3 of them the theological virtues being the heavenly principles. But this 4 plus 3 concept also looks awfully similar to the symbols in the domains. There's the world in the middle, created and represented by Phanes, one of the shades, the 3 eyes on one side are the other 3 shades, and the 3 eyes on the other side are the heavenly principles. Now, since the Heavenly Principles won the war and earned the right to reshape the world as they saw fit, they most likely enslaved the Moon Sisters to create a new set of rules, the Fortuna, and to write a new fate for the world as a consequence. I believe they were enslaved because I still believe that Sasti is one of the shades, and she has been given the task to sustain the Heavenly Principles, so she's basically working under them. Then, as Nabumalikata said, something happened between the Seelie and the Heavenly Principles, and they were cast out of the heavens, stripped of their memories and their forms, cursed to hear the call of the heavens but never to be allowed to go back. Once again, this sounds like the usual curse of the Heavenly Principles that erases memories and turns the afflicted into some kind of monster, only in this case they're benign and cute at least. What I mean to say in the end is that the 3 Moon Sisters may be higher versions of the Seelie, like their rulers, and they suffer the same fate. The one thing I just can't figure out is why there is a moon in the sky, one in the Spiral Abyss, one in Karya, and one in 6 other but identical looking domains. Clear Pool and Mountain Cavern, Domain of Guyon, Hidden Place of Joe Formula, Midsummer Courtyard, Ridge Watch, and Valley of Remembrance. The murals in the domains also hold some other secret. This is Phanes' egg, from which he was born and in which he created Teyvat. On one side there are the other 3 shades and on the other the heavenly principles. Above there's either the Primordial One and the second Who came, or just the Primordial One, which would mean that the heavenly principles are part of him and it would be strange, while another possibility, and I'm just throwing it there just for fun, is that this mural represents the current state of things. So this is the second Who came, these are the shades of the Primordial One, and these are the 3 descendants that have come to Teyvat up until now, sent by the second Who came, with the first one being the heavenly principles because Nahida defines it as a singular being. In this case, the heavenly principles are ruling over Teyvat, while the other 2, sent to look for the Genesis Pearl, eventually rebelled against the heavenly principles and were punished for it, which is what we, as the 4th Descenders, will probably do as well. Anyway, what's interesting about the murals are also the symbols at the top. The one in the middle should be the old world, since there are 7 points that converge toward the massive being, like the authorities that the Primordial One stole from the dragons. But what are the other symbols? Are those 4 moons? Anyway, and to conclude, we don't really have any major proof about the Moon Sisters and their relation to Fate. I mean, we only know about their existence. But the fact that we've been fed these references with the Moirai one too many times now makes me think that we are being, indeed, intentionally led astray. And that's it, I hope you liked the video. If you did, don't forget to leave a thumbs up, and if you're interested in Genshin Impact theory videos, consider subscribing. The video was too long, so I will cut the outro short. I'll see you again probably with the analysis of Cyno's second story quest, but for now, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, over and out.